If you like these videos, please check out my full course at www.lsat.totaltestprep.net with tons of clearly explained actual LSAT questions written by someone who's mastered test and helped others master it, and an evaluation period where you only pay if you want to continue.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the frequent grouping rules. So, a common thing is that you can use a circle to show that elements can go together. So, for example, if you have a rule that says that A and B have the same sponsor, that means that A and B are going to go in the same column, you would draw A and B with a circle around them. And it's fairly straightforward. That just basically means that wherever you find A, you always have to find B. Now, if they can't go together, so if you had something like A and B do not have the same sponsor, they have to be in separate columns, put them in a circle, but just draw a cross or a dash through the circle as well. So it works both ways. You can also use equals or not equal signs to show that groups have overlapping members or cannot have overlapping members. So for example, if we had a rule that says that sponsors X and Y don't have the same runners, meaning whoever's in X cannot be in Y, and vice versa, then you can just draw X is not equals to Y. So generally speaking, I recommend using the equals or not equal sign when you have these kinds of relationships between structural elements that they can or cannot have the same movable elements. And as usual, you can place your movable elements directly into the diagram if it's possible. So C is one of the runners sponsored by Z. Well, you can just put the C straight into that slot. So basically, you just put it in there, and you know that once again, you're dealing with a situation. Anytime you make the diagram, the C has to be there. And you can also use the equals and not equal signs if that might be easier to work with depending on other things that you've drawn, etc. So it'll sometimes come up, based on context. So equals works as well. Although I generally recommend leaving the equals for those situations where you're showing a relationship between structural elements, like we did here with the X and Y. I tend to use it for that. Okay, likewise, you'll find that conditional rules are actually more common for grouping games. So if you look over on the right, we see that we added a new rule at the bottom. It says that if D is sponsored by X, then A is sponsored by Z. So in these situations, you can use subscripts to show that the elements in the conditions are assigned to particular groups. Now, what does that mean? Well, so I have it down here. I just drew the D subscript X arrow A subscript Z. So this is a situation where it's a complex rule because it relates the assignment of one letter to a structure with the assignment of another letter to another structure. So there's a couple of relationships going on here. And whenever you have that, or not whenever, but a lot of the times when you have that, you can use subscripts to more simply write this out. So D subscript X means D is assigned to X. A subscript Z means A is assigned to Z. And then this basically tells us if D is in X, then A is in Z. And you always also want to write out the contrapositives, just because this is something that is going to be very useful when you're going through the rules to try to see if the diagram that you're drawing for your specific answer choice is accurate. It's sometimes easier to see particular information if you have your contrapositive out there than just looking at the conditional as you've drawn. Now, a caveat to that is that if the rule is complex or strange and it would take too much time to make a contrapositive, if you find yourself just sitting there and thinking about, okay, what would the contrapositive look like here? What do I do? How do I translate it? Then you can skip it. It's really only for these situations where it's just a mechanical flip and negate. Then you can just put the contrapositive in there right away. Now just remember, conditional rules can be satisfied even if they're not activated. So if the sufficient condition isn't true, then the rule is inactive and it's still satisfied. So if you have a situation, so this tells you if D is in X, then A is in Z. Well, if it turns out, then, well, if we've got the D over here, if we put the D in X, we know the A has to go here. But if the D is in Y, that's fine. A can go anywhere else, because the thing with the conditional rules is they tell you that if something is true, if D is in X, then you got to pay attention to the rule. Otherwise, you don't have to worry about it. So you don't have to remember, this is one of the ways in which they try to trick you with the false negation, is if you see that you don't have D in X, that does not necessarily mean that the rule is not true. It just means that it's not activated. And for these conditional rules, you only pay attention to them if they are activated. If they're not, you just go about your day, go to the next rule. Okay, so you're going to have combination and complex games with respect to the rules that we went over. So combination games are basically groups and sequence. Complex games are the ones that involve multiple sets. And essentially, you're going to be incorporating symbolization from both the linear and grouping games. And I want you to remember that the subscripts are good tools to capture those more complex relationships, which is when you have a relationship like something is put into something else on the condition that something goes somewhere else. Or if it's a complex game where you have groups in sequence, it might say that something is in a particular group and it's before something else which is in another group. So that's also multiple relationships. So subscripts are a good thing to keep in mind. And then we'll encounter this in future lessons and exercises. So I just want you to be aware of that you can pay attention to that, to the subscripts as a good tool. So there's certain additional considerations. You're not going to be able to use the symbols for all of the rules. There's the basic rules that have the stuff we went over, but not all of them will use symbols. So there are rules that don't fit these patterns and that are very specific to particular games. The basic point is use abbreviations that make sense to you. If you can't use the standard symbols we've been using, there might be another symbol that makes sense to you given that particular rule. And at the end of the day, if you can't think of a symbol, you can simply abbreviate it. Just write it out shorthand. So the way you want to do this, just in general, is you want to approach the rules by visualizing what they're telling you in terms of the diagram. I can't stress that enough. Don't think about runners and places and sponsors and athletes or whatever it is. Think of it in terms of letters and columns and rows when we incorporate rows as well. So think of it in terms of just the basic geometry. So you want to translate that rule into the basic geometry, like I said, the letters, columns, rows, and etc. And you want to work with that. That's what's going to give you an idea what symbolizations you should use or how to abbreviate it. Because that's actually secondary. The most important thing is for you to have an understanding of what it means in terms of the game, in terms of the diagram. And likewise, you're going to be tempted to put everything into the diagram, like we did here. But don't try to do that. It's going to make it cluttered. So really, it's only those situations where something can go somewhere, or something has to go somewhere, or something cannot go somewhere. Really, that's why I want you to put it in. For the rest of them, it's generally a good idea to write it out in terms of a vertical list of the rules. But you'll use your judgment. If you find that it's easier for you to to put things into the diagram, you can do that. But you want to write out the rules in a vertical list, like I said, for easy scanning and reference. And that's something that we'll see as we go through the exercises and the question types and all that, is when you have the rules in a vertical list, then you can easily just scan down them to see if a particular rule is met with the test diagram that you're making, if there's any problem, etc. So just easier to make sure that you've hit everything. If you've got stuff in your diagram, it's a bit of a trade-off, because on the one hand, you may be able to see additional considerations or implications, logical implications, a little bit more easily, and we'll get to this all in later lessons when we're actually doing this stuff. So there is an advantage to putting stuff into the diagram directly, but there's also a disadvantage in that it may be cluttered, you may miss something, and I generally tend to lean towards writing stuff out that isn't obviously something that you can put into the diagram, like, hey, A goes in spot 1 or C cannot go in spot 3. That stuff you don't want to put in the diagram. You do want to put in the diagram. But anything more than that, generally you want to write it out. Okay, so quick summary. Rules are constraints that limit the number of diagrams you can make. They act by setting up the relationship between the movable elements, between the structural elements, or between movable and structural elements. And the best way of dealing with them is by symbolizing them or abbreviating.